Data centers are fundamental for the development of AI.
SpaceX, and it's targeting around $1.75 trillion valuation, which would make it the biggest IPO in history.
The tax system was created based on the idea that people would generate most of their wealth through labor and not through assets.
Hey everybody, my name's Ross.
And my name is Fede.
And we are two humans talking about some of the current events in tech, politics, and everything happening in the world today. So today we're going to be talking about Claude Mythos, revolutionizing cybersecurity, Mamdani and his new mansion tax in New York, data centers being banned in several states potentially, new IPO and acquisitions, and the Iran war and how it's affecting energy prices in Europe. So let's get started.
Thank you for the intro, Ross. Let's start from Anthropic Mythos model that was released by Anthropic on the 7th of April, 2026. It is a cybersecurity model that seems to be several orders of magnitude better than any other model we have previously seen released by the frontier models, whether we're talking about OpenAI, Anthropic, or Google. And because of these reasons, Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, has decided that he wouldn't release it directly to the public, but he has created a consortium of 50 companies that will be given access to this model in order to patch some cybersecurity threats that have been found on the internet and in different databases. Why is this important today? And what are the implications?
Yeah, so they've made a model that is essentially really good at finding and patching security threats in systems, right? And obviously the flip side of that is that people could use this model to find and exploit the same vulnerabilities. So they didn't release this to everybody. And yet also there was a hacking or exploit done where people got hold of it. They were not officially part of the companies that were given access to the initial model. So there were other parties that happened to have access to Mythos as well during the initial release. So it's interesting that a model is now considered dangerous enough that it's not allowed to be released to the public, first of all, right? I think that's an interesting...
Certainly something we haven't seen before.
Yeah. Interesting to me that the model is sort of so specific in its use case. I'm sure it can do a lot of things, but if they're really going down this route of making it a cybersecurity specific model, that's something that we haven't necessarily seen that much in an LLM before. Well, we've seen coding, but this cybersecurity focused one seems to be relatively new or unique, focused on that one aspect, I think.
I think cybersecurity has been a topic that has been recurring and coming up through the different model releases. Especially since the beginning of 2026, we have had OpenClaw being released, which is one of the most powerful tools. But his biggest flaw was his security, the fact that it could be prompt engineered from an outsider, or the risk of it downloading and deleting things on your laptop, or even giving away your bank details. And then we had OpenAI acquiring OpenClaw, and then Anthropic releasing their own version of OpenClaw, which is Claude Cowork. And so all of these tools are extremely powerful, but you need to give them full access to your laptop. And so I think that a lot of enterprises and private individuals have been holding back their use of these private tools because of cybersecurity threats. So to some extent, I feel like it could have been foreseen that cybersecurity would have been the next move. Interestingly enough, OpenAI released its own version of a cybersecurity model in Model 5.4, just 2 weeks after Anthropic discussed Mythos. So I don't know if OpenAI developed it in 2 weeks or if they already had planned to enter this arena. The thing that is interesting, though, is that, as you say, Anthropic has made this model not available. And there's been speculation that perhaps it wasn't done as an act of protection of the system that we live in, but it could have been done due to the limited capabilities in their infrastructure to make the model available to everyone. And so it could also work as a marketing strategy. I have no ability to say whether it was a marketing strategy or whether they're trying to protect the current system. But the fact that they have been hacked and that the model is now in the hands of other people that weren't authorized, perhaps it should worry us a little bit.
Do you think there's something interesting in the idea that certain models are so heavy on the usage that companies have to restrict them to X amount of users or pay a lot extra to use these features, because if it was available to everybody, it wouldn't be sustainable as a business model. So do you think there might be a case in the future where models are really, really good at certain tasks and we have to pay for access to certain things? So I'm thinking of Sora by OpenAI, where their video generation model was released to the public and then pulled less than a year afterwards because it was so taxing on them and it wasn't really giving them much benefit as a company. I guess people weren't using it as much as they thought, and it was just draining all of their compute and power. So it was pulled quite suddenly and quite unexpectedly. And I could see a world where people who are making movies, for example, now pay to use these video generation models a bit more specifically, and they pay a bit extra. And things like that we thought were going to be in everybody's hands might actually still be in the hands of the film directors and the movie makers, which in some ways makes them feel a little bit less scary, because if everybody can make a movie, there's something nice about that, but it also dilutes the appeal of people who make movies as a profession. So it could be that these tools that were going to be in everybody's hands may actually still be in the hands of the professionals and the experts. You see what I mean?
There are certainly two categories here. The first part is the financial aspect of how these companies are running, in my opinion. And certainly Sora was one of the examples of the most intense and expensive models to run that were being largely used by people, and where OpenAI lost the most money. So to some extent, the fact that it has been now blocked from access to the public makes sense. It could still be that in the future they will make it available to, as you say, private directors and studio labs, because they had mentioned that they wanted to make deals with Disney and other movie makers. But obviously it is extremely expensive to run. And I think that in the latest update of Claude, Anthropic did a similar move. They now made Claude Code available only to the subscriptions that are paying £100 a month or more, while before it was available to the people paying £20 a month. And so it could be that as they expand their customer base and they look at the usage of tokens, they might prevent some tools from being distributed widely to everybody else. Then the second part is the distribution question that you mentioned. And so on the one hand, we want to enable everybody to access these tools so that it can unlock new productivity levels and also develop new products and services. But on the other hand, and I think we mentioned this in past episodes as well, where is the unique selling point and the moat and the defensibility of these companies if anybody can now build anything?
Yeah, I was just
Right?
going to say that. I think it's interesting that, it feels as if these tools are locked inside the big players like OpenAI and Google and things, but actually you can make homemade AI generated videos with things like Stable Diffusion, and these models are open source and open access. So I wonder if we'll see kind of a rise in DIY tools if these things are unlocked. We know they exist and then they're taken away. It's difficult to shut the Pandora's box with some of these things.
I have a question for you. Do you think that the open source Chinese models will become more popular? I've heard of many people that are now running their OpenClaw using the Chinese models because they consume a lot less tokens and they're cheaper. Is this something that we will see more and more common?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I haven't seen that much from the Chinese models recently. I mean, I know there was the big DeepSeek revolution last year where it had similar capabilities to ChatGPT, and it was much cheaper. It was free to access the reasoning model, etc. And then I haven't seen that much from them in the last few months. But I think absolutely this is something that we're going to see more and more, sort of DIY AI processes and workflows. I think we'll see that coming back a little bit as well. It's interesting that nobody's made a full-length movie with AI, to my knowledge, that's actually good, despite the tools being in existence. So I think what may have been happening is that the users who are serious pro users of ChatGPT were not using Sora much, and the users who were using it were just free users who were making silly videos of giraffes surfing and things. So I think there weren't that many people who were using it professionally with the pro sort of mindset. Maybe that was it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Going back to Mythos real quick, we've also seen Anthropic being one of the advocates in favor of the slowdown of AI development mostly for safety reasons, as well as we've seen Dario Amodei advocating for a slowdown in the build-outs of data centers. Now, is it possible that Dario was trying to prevent some of the data centers to be from being built because this could be a way to stop companies such as Microsoft, Meta, and Google that have their own data centers already, and they can train their model internally and give Anthropic an opportunity to prevent them from using these assets? Could this be a strategy?
It could be, I suppose. It depends if you're thinking of this as a strategy to slow down their competition, or if they're genuinely worried about some of their developing capabilities with the models, and they truly are trying to sort of play things safe. With Mythos, if they'd have just released it to the public, it could have had massive security concerns. So I like to believe that maybe they're doing it from a altruistic kind of make sure we slow down and do things properly so that we don't accidentally release something harmful to the public. I mean, slowing down the data centers, I think, to me, read more like an energy and cost problem, right? So maybe let's move on to that next. And that's a good segue into our next section, which is about data centers and how they're being banned or limited.
Can I ask you one last question before we move to the data centers?
Absolutely.
If Mythos was hacked and someone else has access to it, now it has been a few days and we still don't know if anything has been hacked. What do you think will be either the first companies or governments or systems been hacked? And how will we find out? I've thought about it before. What would you hack if you had access to Mythos?
Yeah, I guess, what would I hack? I'd love to see if aliens are real. That would be my first hack.
Is it like the CIA or NASA's database?
The CIA, Area 51 systems. I think, realistically, I'd just get passwords and steal loads of money, I suppose. But I think it's still not a magic system. It just finds vulnerabilities in things. So you'd still have to pick a target, find a vulnerability, and use it against somebody. It's not just a magic thing that will go through the internet and pull back all of the passwords of every website in existence. So you still have to use it like a tool. So, yeah. But in the sillier version of that, I guess I would, hack, maybe I shouldn't say. What?
Yeah, we can
Who would you hack? Yeah. Who would you hack?
We can have. I don't know. I'm just thinking about the different groups that might have had access to the tool. Some people claim that there might be some Chinese-backed hackers, and so their main concern could be perhaps a U.S. military.
Yeah, I didn't want to say that on air in case we get drone strikes.
I mean, we're not involved with any of it, so I think it would be easy to find that we have nothing to do with this. But as you said, and there was a good piece on Bloomberg Tech, I think a couple of days ago, where they were explaining that a vulnerability in the system is not a magic trick that then allows you to do anything you want. It just allows a software such as Mythos to exploit the vulnerability, either to change the code or either to change a specific structure of the database that perhaps could lead to bigger issues, but it's not a magic trick. It's going to take a lot more time and effort to actually have a real impact if somebody else was truly using this tool.
Yeah. And I think they'd probably patch many of the things as fast as they possibly could using Mythos as a discovery tool. So
yeah,
there's probably a new arms race now where people are patching as many vulnerabilities as they can before this inevitably gets released wider. So if we talk about, as we just mentioned, data centers potentially being banned or limited in some US states now, could you tell me a little bit about this, Fede? Because this is kind of your realm in the energy and center world.
Yeah, I study the energy transition in the UK. I study different flexibility assets, and data centers are certainly one of the biggest topic of discussions in this field. Data centers are fundamental for the development of AI, and I think everybody has heard of them. And they sit kind of in the middle of the stack of the AI vertical sector. So obviously at the top, we have the tools that everybody uses every day, such as Claude and OpenAI, but all the models need to be trained on very large computers that are many orders of magnitude larger than what we have in our homes. And so these computers are all located into a data center. And then if we want to go at the bottom of the chain, we have the semiconductors, which are the materials used to make the data centers, as well as the energy generation, which is what powers the data centers. Now, data centers are located all over the world, but there is a clear concentration in specific countries that are usually the most developed countries, including the US and the UK. The main problem that data centers have is that they've always existed. They've existed for over 40 years, but they have never used as much energy as they're doing in these days. Whether your company has a database or uses clouds or is storing their data, this data is probably being processed by the data centers. And in order to power them, they have really large energy consumptions, really large water consumption, and at the same time, they have the tendency to make the electricity price more expensive in specific regions where they are located. So this brings a really interesting point for discussion, which is we need the data centers in order to support AI development and make every country economically more productive.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is a risk to increase electricity prices for the locals and potentially have some environmental implications. So how do we balance the economic and environmental and social impact that these infrastructures have?
Yeah, I guess I have two questions from what you just said. Firstly, do you think that banning is pretty much to do with the price of electricity getting too high in these locations, and they're trying to stop crazy growth into the future where it will make the price just totally unsustainable for local people in those states? The second question is, do you think if the US and other more developed countries start to ban or restrict data center or new data centers being built, what does that mean for the rest of the world? Does that mean that other countries, developing countries, are going to start catching up to the West in terms of data center building and usage? And are there some ramifications to that as well?
So your first question is, what is the impact and why they're banning them?
Why are they banning them? Yeah, and is that I get the impression it's mainly due to prices of electricity, and once you get too many data centers in one place, the electricity costs go through the roof, right? Is that the main reason they're banning them?
Yeah. So from my understanding of what I read, especially in the US, electricity prices is the main reason. And obviously, just like any other market, is a matter of demand and supply. The supply of energy hasn't gone up because there has been very few energy projects that have been built in the last few years, while the energy demand has soared because of the data centers. So the price has become more expensive for everybody in a specific region. So that could be one of the main reasons why the data centers are being banned. There is probably also a little bit of fear about AI. So there is probably some countries or states where people feel the pressure or the risk to lose their jobs to AI. And so preventing data centers from being built and expanded could be a way to fight their way back from AI taking over their job. So I would say that these are probably the two main reasons why someone would be against data centers. However, I also think that, as you said, what happens if the US or Western countries were to stop their data center developments? I think, in my opinion, what would happen is that countries like China, Russia, and other countries that see the value in data centers and the value in AI will still continue to develop their own infrastructure, and they will be extremely powerful. Now, there could be some economical consequences where countries that have better AI potentially have economies that are growing significantly faster. And so I think that overall, making sure that our data center growth is as sustainable possible is the key. Overall, we do want our economy to grow. We do want people to increase their salary and wealth. And so data centers are probably the way to go.
Interesting. I've got a couple more questions that come up from what you just said again.
Yeah, sure.
So if countries like Russia and China now become the leading data center locations, if the US and the West starts to ban them for these reasons, does that introduce possible security concerns in terms of important data passing through these nations that might not be friendly to the West in certain cases? Secondly, what happens if data centers move to other developing countries? It might be cheaper to build data centers in countries like Indonesia or India or Brazil, for example, in the future. These are big countries with lots of people, developing economies quite rapidly. But what does that mean, for example, for us using the data centers here? Will it become more expensive if we have to outsource the data to these other countries? Will it have negative effects on the people in those countries in terms of electricity getting more expensive? Or maybe they'll have more development in their infrastructure for that reason, and could it be helpful? What's your thoughts on those two things?
Yep. Those are great questions. I think that this brings up the problem of ownership, really. So data centers can be owned by private companies and they also can be owned by states. For instance, the Chinese government owns lots of data centers. There is almost a linear correlation between how many data centers you have and how good your AI models are. Because the better infrastructure you have, the longer and more models you can train, and potentially the better AI then you develop. To some extent, there is a bit of an AI war happening, as we have said in one of our past podcasts. And if a country like Russia or China had the best AI model, they probably wouldn't use it just for the well-being of their own citizens. They might try to overthrow governments in other countries, and they can easily do that by influencing social media, stealing data in government databases. And so from a security and safety perspective, it is important that the leading models are in countries with more stable governments, specifically Europe and North America. Now, if a private company that owns a data center puts it in another country, that is perfectly. In fact, there is even companies that are trying to put data centers in space so that they don't have issues related to the laws of specific states or countries. The main issue is where the energy comes from and the latency of the model. So there is some disadvantages connecting to a data center that is further away from you. But for example, anybody just like me and you can rent a data center for a few hours to run models, and you can pick data centers all over the world. It will just perhaps take you 100 millisecond more for the data to travel from your location to the data center and back. So it's not the end of the world. But if it was owned by a government, for example, you wouldn't want your NHS data to be stored in China or in South America, for example, because for safety reasons, if there was a blackout or just the fact that the data center isn't physically in your country can be a disadvantage.
And could governments that wish to use that data or access it somehow and make that a security concern for another country? Just hypothetically, I'm not saying any country versus any other. I'm just saying, say you have one country that's not super friendly to another. This country decides to process some data in that one. Could that country then access some of it and use it against them in a sort of security troubling way?
Yeah, I mean, if it was a cyber attack, I think it would still have to go through the cyber route, but you can still unplug or cause a blackout in the data center. And the country that owns the data will then be finding themselves with no access to that data. So the risk remains.
Yeah.
From an energy perspective, powering a data center requires a lot of energy. But it is true that some companies are building data centers in companies that have either cheaper energy or just less regulation about the type of energy infrastructure that can be built. Now, if we want to assess the problem from a European and North American perspective, governments should understand the value the data centers build from an economical perspective, and at the same time realize that there are ways to make data center build-outs and powering sustainable. And this is mostly through renewable energy and the use of batteries. This would not also power the data center, but it would also strengthen the energy generation system of the country and make the country safer from an energy perspective, because now we would have better infrastructure to generate and transport the energy, but also safer from a cyber and technical perspective where we have our own data centers and we can train our own models. So I think that banning data centers is perhaps not the right strategy at the moment.
Yeah, because we've talked before about how renewable energies could work quite well with data centers. Do you think it's the case that if we start to ban or restrict them, that could be quite a short-sighted thing to do? Because yes, you're reducing the energy consumption of these massive data centers, but the future economical benefits that could be brought by having, as you say, local AI and these things may be the future of the economy in many ways, right? So if you're sort of forcibly outsourcing them to other countries, not only are you making your own economy weaker in the long term, you're making developing countries' electricity more expensive. So
yeah, you said it exactly. I think we've seen the power that AI has. We could have cheaper, more powerful AI and better renewable energy all in one country. And in the past, renewable energy also had an issue with financing, because it can take 20 to 25 years for the cost of the project to be reached and then become profitable. But at the same time, once you have a data center that is extremely profitable, you can afford to pay slightly more expensive and finance these renewable assets in a more sustainable way from a financial perspective. So the two things go hand in hand if we decide to make them work together.
Yeah, it almost kind of has parallels to, manufacturing and hardcore industry, where these things kind of began in Europe and the West and then moved across the world as prices and cheapness of resources and labor became factors. And then maybe we'll see the same thing happen to data centers. But I think it's a great transition and segue to talk about renewable energy and one of our other topics we were going to talk about today, which is the Iran war and the energy price shock we're seeing because of the trouble in the Strait of Hormuz. Do you want to introduce this topic in terms of energy?
Yeah, sure.
I think we're all aware that the Iran war has been waged for the last couple of months. It turns out that Iran didn't really need a nuclear weapon after all, because they have a pretty powerful trump card already, which is the ability to close one of the most important straits in the entire world, the Strait of Hormuz, where a large proportion of the world's oil supply flows through every day. And we've seen Iran try to blockade the strait. We've seen America try to counter-blockade the strait. Turns out, as long as the threat of a blockade is there to some of these ships carrying the oil, it just absolutely disrupts the entire flow through the strait. Just the threat of it, you don't even need to do anything. You just have to say, "Oh, we've put mines in the strait, and you're not allowed to pass." It's very easy to blockade it, and it's just caused absolute mayhem.
I'm not a political journalist, so I'm not going to go in detail about the geopolitical implication of the war. But just talking about the energy perspective, I think that Europe might be one of the countries that suffered the most. Of course, countries like India are already suffering. There is other countries across the world that are going through their gas rationing very quickly. But one of the main problems that Europe has had for decades, because we've seen it in 2016, we've seen it in 2022 with the Russian war, we're seeing again in 2026 with the Iran conflict, is that Europe has been talking about energy security, energy independence for 20 years, and we still haven't achieved it, right? We talk about how many wind farms Germany has, but Germany is still running on coal. We talk about all the wind projects done in the UK, and then we still depend on gas, and gas sets the price for the cost of electricity in the UK. Obviously, I don't know what the implication short term will be, because now we're acquiring more gas from Russia. In the past few weeks, there's been a shortage of jet fuels. So I've seen that there is airplanes in Italy that are not flying on a regular schedule. And the amount, just if I remember correctly from some of the numbers portrayed by the Financial Times, even if the strait was opened back today, it would take about 5 to 6 weeks before there's new shipments arriving in Europe. And so the price of gas is pretty much been affected from now until the end of the year, at least until December. Even with increased amount of shippings, we wouldn't be able to cover the amount of gas that has been lost in this past month. So the question that I think every government in Europe and the European Union and the UK should address is, how much do we truly want to be energy independent? How much money are we willing to invest? And do we actually have the belief that being energy independent will allow us to build a stronger, safer economy for all the citizens? And I think the answer is yes to all of these questions. And I think that there should be much stronger incentive to develop renewable power, to develop battery projects, and make all of the countries as independent as possible from countries that unfortunately are less geopolitically stable than our continent. But this is my opinion, and probably I can't, so I'm not going to add anything further.
Yeah, it doesn't look like the trouble is ending anytime soon either, does it? I mean, I'm not entirely sure who Trump is even negotiating with anymore, because does Iran have a new stable government yet? I don't think so. They've eliminated most of the top officials that used to be part of the main government, and now who are they negotiating with? Do they have the authority to open the strait even? I'm not sure. So the next thing we're going to talk about is a bit of a segue into Mamdani and his new mansion tax, as some people are calling it, in New York City.
Yeah, do you want to introduce it?
Yeah, sure. So this is where there's a new tax being proposed, which is a pied-à-terre tax, which is a tax on homes valued over $5 million, which are not the owner's primary residence. And the owner of these homes doesn't live in New York City. So these are being used as investments or vacation homes. And this is in a city where the cost of living is very expensive, and New Yorkers often struggle to find decent places to live. And lots of the properties in the city are being bought up as investment pieces because the prices rise so much. So this tax is designed to help the cost of living and the renting housing crisis in the city. Some people are calling it a socialist policy, which in the US is a big buzzword against anything that they don't like in some cases. And some people are praising it. It's a kind of tax that exists in several other countries already, such as France and Canada. So it's not a unique or new thing that doesn't exist elsewhere. And Mamdani himself is coming under fire from people in the Republican Party and the government as a democratic socialist, but I think broadly New Yorkers are quite supportive of this. Many working New Yorkers love the focus on addressing the cost of living and the housing crisis. What are your thoughts on this? Have you seen any other kind of takes on news on this story?
I think this is not a new topic. It's not the first time that we heard taxes about second and third properties. In the UK, we had the new stamp duty that was introduced just 2 years ago, I believe, that had a similar effect, just making sure that there is a way to redistribute wealth, as some of the most wealthy people in the country buy every single property that is on the market.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great investment for them. The asset appreciates. They can sometimes rent it out and gain even more, and then they can sell it, and it's a great investment for them as
Are you in favor
asset owners.
or against the tax?
I am massively in favor of this kind of tax because I think we've talked before on the podcast about wealth tax, but this is the kind of tax that's actually much more realistic. With a wealth tax, wealth can be hidden and it's difficult to quantify, and it's often got implications on having to sell assets, whereas a targeted and specific tax on something that only the richest could possibly afford, something that's not going to affect them in any meaningful way because it's not their primary residence. So in terms of living quality of life, all it's doing is trying to reduce the number of properties that are left vacant in New York City to increase the supply for real working people on the ground, which is who we should be thinking about when we make policy, in my opinion. For the most part, they should be the people that direct the policy. And I think New York is in dire need of somebody like Mamdani to focus on the real life people who actually live and work in the city. For the longevity of the city, you need people living and working in New York. And everywhere where these kinds of things are happening, I think it's one of the best ways that you can literally target wealth in a way that's fair and specific and actually quantifiable.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this is the right choice. And I think that Mamdani, based on what he has done so far, he has made the right decisions in New York. I think that when you have a city that is as populous as New York, and you and I have lived in London, so we know exactly what we refer to when we say this. It is extremely important that affordability is reflected across the whole spectrum of people, because the difference in income levels is staggering when you have 10 million people living in the same country. And the same way that the lawyers and the tech entrepreneurs live in London and live in New York, the same way do the bartenders and the waiters and the teachers. And so you need to make sure that the ecosystem is sustainable. The other thing that I would add, and I'm going to do a little self-promotion because I did write an article called "I'll Show You Why Taxes Are Great," which is on my Substack, and I'll probably link it to in the description below, where I was explaining that the tax system that we have in most Western countries was created based on the idea that people would generate most of their wealth through labor and not through assets. And this is why we tax labor higher than we do for capital gains taxes. Now, the system has completely changed because the tax system that was built 80, 90 years ago doesn't reflect the way in which the ultra wealthy in particular generate their wealth. They usually generate most of the wealth from stocks and assets and rentals and appreciation of houses in New York and in London, where you can buy them today at 5 million, never live in any of these houses, and then sell them in a couple years' time at double the price. Now, the same way that we have evolved, and now there is new different ways to generate an income through investment rather than through labor, the same way we should evolve the tax system and make sure that the redistribution of money in the system is done in a fair way. There is no point in having governments that print money in order to keep up with inflation, with the depreciation, in order to facilitate the liquidity of the market, if all the money is then stored in bank accounts of these ultra wealthy. Because the truth is that the reason why inflation and poverty are rising is that we've printed all this money and then we've stacked it away inaccessible to 99% of people. And then the people that have all this money can now go and buy all the properties on the market. And so all of a sudden, there are no properties. The properties are extremely expensive and the people have no money.
Exactly.
And then people complain that we have printed too much money, but the money is not even circulating in the economy. So I think the tax is the right way to approach this.
Yeah, because these things are not just sat in bank accounts. They are sat in assets like the houses in New York City. And this is a great tax because it's not going after successful New Yorkers. You know, I have nothing against successful people. If you live in New York, this tax doesn't affect you if it's your primary residence. If you need a second apartment in New York for work purposes, this still doesn't affect you because it's only on properties over $5 million, which are not most, work landing pad flats, for example. I mean, a successful person may need that. I get that. This tax still wouldn't affect them. It's only going after 99% of people that this tax will affect will be investment property buyers who do not live in the city. They may not even visit the place, and they're just literally using it to store wealth.
Yeah, I agree. You said it very well.
I like Mamdani as well because he's, I think, doing a great job at connecting with New Yorkers. He focuses on New York so much when he talks about any answer that he gives to the press. He's always focusing it on New York and the people of New York. He's done a great job getting close to Trump, even though he's a democratic socialist. I think he's managed to charm Trump into liking him enough to allow him to enact some of these policies without trying to stop him too much. I think it's a shame that he wasn't born in the US and won't be running for president one day because I think he's just such a great speaker. He really is very good.
Those are all good points. Independently of what party Mamdani sits in, and he calls himself a social democrat, the thing that I like is that we can judge him based on the policies that he's making. And I think that this is something that politics, whether we're talking about Europe, the UK, or the US, we've been struggling to see. People get attacked just based on the title that they identify with, whether they're Republican, Democrats, or something else. And I think that we are forgetting to evaluate the policies and the proposals, right? There are so many different ideals, and this is probably because of social media and because of how mainstream media has become a little bit polarizing as well. But as soon as we hear how a politician refers to himself as a Republican or a Democrat, then all of a sudden we're attacking them without even listening to what they have to say. And I think that perhaps in New York and perhaps in many other states and countries and cities as well, we'll finally realize that we need to evaluate any mayoral or government or presidential candidate based on the policies that they recommend and based on the goals that they want to achieve for the citizens. And I think that's what Mamdani is doing.
Absolutely. I think it highlights the importance of local representation in politics because of his focus on New York is really, really great to see. And it's something I haven't seen for a long time in a politician where they've really, really just been so focused on supporting the people that they represent in a specific geographical location or city. It's really refreshing, I think. And we could use a bit more of that here, I think, as well.
I also would like to add is the fact that he wasn't backed by hundreds of millions of pounds like other candidates were. And so his rise to the role of mayor was entirely genuine and done by speaking to people and just like promoting his ideas and having people appreciating what he was standing for, rather than having these campaigns that are just sponsored by private companies, lobbyists, multimillionaires that just want to see their friends run for politics.
Yeah. It's such a shame that concept feels so refreshing, but that's the way it should be done. You're right.
It shouldn't be refreshing. It should be the normality.
Exactly. So why don't we talk about the final topic of this week's current events? We're going to be talking about the SpaceX IPO and also the acquisitions it's been doing recently. So this is a news story where SpaceX has confidentially filed for IPO, which is probably going to happen this summer. And it's targeting around $1.75 trillion valuation, which would make it the biggest IPO in history if it happens like that.
The scale of SpaceX is beyond imagination. There are a couple of figures that come to mind. So first of all was the fact that their valuation, as you said, is going to be between 1.75 trillions and 2 trillions, which, just to put it into perspective, is 2,000 billions, right? The biggest IPO ever before SpaceX was Uber and was 67 billions. So we're talking about a 15x. That's how big SpaceX is. Nobody can even fathom how big this company is.
That's a bit about where, I think you know more about these companies than I do. So could you tell me about where the value comes from SpaceX that makes it worth $2 trillion potentially?
Yeah. I mean, the valuation is potentially a little generous there has been many investors that have invested in the private rounds that are very eager, and they've been waiting a long time to get out of these positions. And so it is possible that the valuation is generous, and in fact could be that after the IPO in June, we'll see the stock go down by several percentage points. Now, SpaceX is selling the present and is selling the future. From a present perspective, they have a lot of satellites being shipped every day. Obviously, they have Starlinks that has millions of users around the world. And they're also in many partnership programs with NASA and many other space companies. And at the moment, they are the largest space company. If I remember the numbers correctly, they have shipped over 10,000 satellites into space over the last few years. And the second largest country, the largest country after SpaceX is China with 700. So they have over 10x the amount of satellites that all the companies in China have shipped. So there is no doubt that SpaceX is by far the most successful and largest space company at the moment. Then from a future perspective, what they're selling, it's incredible. They're telling us that they're going to be able to build factories on the moon, and they're going to be able to exploit this to put new energy generation, put new humanoid robots, put new data centers, and then potentially bring some of the products or services that are hosted, host everything on the moon and then provide services on the Earth. If this was the case, this is a game changer. It's like discovering the America in 1492.
It's a bit like what we said earlier about data centers in space. You avoid the regulation. You can do things with the energy and the heat and things like that. It's an amazing idea, isn't it? I can see how Starlink brings so much value to lots of places around the world, which are quite underserved with things like internet infrastructure, which is actually a really amazing altruistic thing to be doing and producing. I can see how it could come together with the Tesla and other X companies to create. We were going to talk about how they've just acquired Cursor, which is an agentic AI tool. They've got the humanoid robot factor. And if all these things come together in the future, you could see a sci-fi movie in the works, right? With SpaceX delivering the space capabilities and the AI and humanoid capabilities from Tesla and the XAI making everything work under the hood. So could be a really interesting one. So it's a $2 trillion valuation because SpaceX is undeniably the leader in the field at the moment. But do you think that's kind of under threat, for example, from things like Blue Origin, the Amazon space agency? This is maybe in an earlier stage of development, but what happens when they become a big player on the scene? Do you think SpaceX's value will go down, or do you think they just got a dominant position in the market where they're just always going to be the space leader?
I think so. Blue Origin, the company founded by Jeff Bezos, I think is many years behind.
Yeah. Apologies. Not an Amazon company. It's a Jeff Bezos company.
But I think that there is Rocket Lab that is very interesting. And I think that there is Intuitive Machines, also known as Lunar, that they're also very interesting, and they're doing many projects with SpaceX as well as individually, both on services that can be provided in the stratosphere, so just around the Earth, as well as on the moon. But again, they're much smaller. And I think that the differentiating factor for SpaceX is that they're owned by Elon. And so the fact that Elon Musk now owns Tesla, they own XAI, which has just been bought by SpaceX, and they just bought Cursor this week. All of a sudden, they are the most vertically integrated company on the planet. Elon has just also announced that they will not be buying chips from NVIDIA anymore. They will be having Samsung deliver some of their chips, and then they will be making all the other chips in-house through the Mojo project. And so all of a sudden, beside getting the primary resources, which at the moment they don't do, but perhaps who knows, they will be able to get something from the moon. I'm not sure, even if they have the right critical minerals there. But beside that, they can build their own chips. They have their own data centers because Elon Musk has been building Colossus, which is a 1 terawatt hour project, which is just 1 terawatt hour is pretty much the same amount of energy that London consumes in a year. So imagine every single light bulb in London powering a data center. That's insane.
Wow.
And then they have their own AI, which is XAI. They have Twitter, X, which is probably the best way to get live news in case they want. And now Twitter is spinning off to become X Money and many other projects. I struggle to see the value of that at the moment. But anyway, they have many other opportunities that could open up because of X. And then they are the only company that has physical AI, which means that they have the cars, and they have the humanoid robots. And so they have an actual physical tool where they can
Yeah.
put the software.
It's really important that they're the company that makes the AI and the physical embodiment of the AI in many ways in the future. That could be such a huge game changer. What do you think it means in the short term, though? So we talked about this 2 trillion valuation might be a little generous. Do you think that's going to impact the stock market in a negative way if we've suddenly got this new $2 trillion valuation company that comes onto the scene and then drops like a stone in the first few months or years?
What I'm thinking, but I'm not necessarily sure. What might happen is in June, the IPO comes. Everybody that has been waiting on the sidelines to buy SpaceX wants to get in. So there's going to be a massive spike in price for the first couple days. Then all the insiders that had SpaceX IPO stocks for the past few years, they will all sell as soon as the price goes up. So they make an extra 10%. They sell and the stock plummets. What I think will happen is that all the other companies, like, the usual Google, Broadcom, Nvidia, will go down because everybody's taking money out to put it into SpaceX. And that will actually be a good moment to get into those other AI leading assets, probably.
Yeah.
Could be what happens. That's what I've seen happening in the past. That's usually what happens when there's a big IPO, but could be different this time.
This is just speculation, of course, and not advice to anybody. Could it be that the big ETFs like the S&P 500, do they have an option to purchase what they don't think is a good investment if it initially comes on the market? Because if they just automatically have to include SpaceX and then it drops, the entire fund would go down, surely.
That is a good point. I do think that they have several weeks, if not months, to decide when to add it. So I think that by the time they add it, the price might be possibly more stable.
That makes sense. And I wonder if it would boost other space companies' value up as well in the converse. So it's difficult to say exactly what the outcome could be. I guess IPOs are always interesting. So let's see what happens with this one, but it's going to be historic either way.
Yeah. And talking about historic IPOs, if OpenAI and Anthropic decide to IPO this year as well, we're going to have the 3 biggest IPO in history all on the same year.
Wow. I think in terms of what makes a good investment right now, people have talked about the AI bubble and how AI is overbought. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we're just getting started, in my personal opinion. I also think humanoid robotics stocks have only just begun to gain traction. So I think that could be one of the next big hitters if people are interested in researching for themselves what could be the next big boom in terms of stock. I reckon humanoid robots might be one of those. We'll see, but it could be.
And chips as well.
Chips as well. Chips have obviously had a huge boom in the last few years, but will continue to do so. As we've talked about earlier in the podcast, data centers and AI training is only going to get more and more vital for the economy and will grow, whether that means it grows in the West or it grows elsewhere. These things are not going anywhere and they're going to continue to expand. So I think all of those things would make good investments, in my opinion.
Yeah. Again, this is not financial advice.
Of course not, but this is my personal thoughts on this that I'm going to do in the next few weeks of investing, as, again, also linking back to the Iran war, where the stock market is maybe a little depressed from what it would be without that. I think we're going to see a bounce back, and it could be a good time to think about what stocks you think are going to be good future players.
Certainly, this is a good time to plan ahead for the rest of this year, as well as the next 3 to 5 years. This is an inflection point. Companies that were relatively flat, such as Broadcom, will benefit greatly from this revolution.
Absolutely. I think we're maybe in a bit of a calm before the storm before big movements happen at the end of this year. So that'll be exciting.
I agree.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Fede. We've covered a few different topics today that are big in the news in tech, politics, and everything in between. So thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you have opinions or topics you'd like us to talk about, please let us know in the comments. Thank you.
All right. See you later, everybody.